So as we get into Romans, I wanted to take one video before we get into kind of the granular of Romans and go through it a little more closely. I wanted to kind of do a bit of a more of a big picture of Romans. Um, Romans is Paul's letter to the church in Rome. Remember Paul from Acts? We read about the guy who was a persecutor of Christians and became a Christian missionary. Um, Perhaps the most famous Christian missionary in the history of Christianity. And anyway, so then the next several books of the Bible we're going to read are letters from Paul, mostly from Paul, to churches in that part of the world. So Romans is Paul's letter to the church in Rome, Paul's letter to the Roman church. We can actually get a pretty good dating on this. When we look back at Acts, remember we're reading Acts and the letters in particular. They are concurrent on a sort of historical timeline. So, based on Acts and some other historical events that we know about, we think that Acts or Romans was likely dictated in the spring of 57 AD. So keep in mind that's about 25 years after Jesus. Okay, so this is not like the week after Jesus. This is 25 years later. So the Church of Jesus Christ has had a little bit of time to get itself established, but not hundreds of years. A little bit of time, not hundreds of years. And you might say dictated? Yeah, dictated. Romans wasn't written, it was dictated. It says so in Romans 16:22, dictated by a guy who worked with Paul or worked for Paul named Tertius. So I can imagine, and this is one of Paul's later letters, I can imagine, just based on the content of this, that Paul is up late one night with Tertius, and Tertius is tired. Like, it's been a long day, Paul. And Paul, his mind is just racing. And he's sort of pacing back and forth in this dimly lit room, making this argument about who Jesus is. And it's kind of stream of consciousness style. If you when you get to reading Romans, you'll understand what I mean. It's sort of stream of consciousness, and Tertius is kind of furiously writing all this down. And I can imagine that the first manuscript, that actual first manuscript, was had a bunch of crossouts and little caret marks, and um, because this is a rhetorical argument that Paul is trying to make. He's trying to work out this idea, and we'll get to this, of what we do with Jews and Gentiles in light of Jesus Christ. It is not a systematic theology. It's not a list of here are 10 theological points we all need to understand. It's a rhetorical argument. He's using rhetorical devices. He's using he's emphasizing things. He's asking rhetorical questions of himself. He's trying to make an argument. He's trying to address a question. And that's really important, especially as we read Romans, because it's not something, therefore, that we can just like grab a verse and plaster it on our bumper stickers very easily, because it's that every word is part of this larger stream of consciousness rhetorical argument. And the bigger picture, in every book of the Bible is most important, but the bigger picture in Romans particularly is more important, or gives us a fuller picture than like an individual word or individual sentence or individual verse would. So, rhetorical argument. The question is, and it's stated in different ways: has God abandoned His people? Because think about it. God made this promise to Abraham. Abraham comes up in Romans 4. God made this promise to Abraham that Abraham's ancestors would be God's people, right? You remember that back in Genesis? And then Jesus comes along and he kind of throws a wrench in that. And now all of a sudden there's these Gentiles, which is just a word for non-Jewish. There's these Gentiles who come around and say, well, hey, Jesus is for me too. or Jesus is for me, and leave out the two. Um, and so the question is like, okay, Paul, he's Jewish, or Judaism was, or Christianity was viewed as a sect of Judaism, like a denomination of Judaism, so to speak, in those days. So Paul says, hey, I'm Jewish, right? I've been circumcised. I grew up in the temple, right? Has God abandoned me for these Gentiles? Can God be trusted? Has God left Israel, the Jews, God's chosen people, out to dry in favor of the Gentiles? And he answers this really early in the 16th verse. He says, for I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's God's saving power for everyone who believes, for the Jew first and also for the Greek. So he's going to get into the question later, but he comes right out at the beginning and answers the question. It's for everybody who believes. And so there's this sort of strange cadence then we start to follow. There's this internal question Paul asks, and he goes down a rabbit hole, and then he sometimes gives an answer, and he plays questioner and answerer as he's pacing around in this dimly lit room. He asks himself questions. Um, well, has God abandoned his people? I don't know. You can imagine him on sort of both sides of the room, arguing with himself. So, a little bit about Rome itself. Paul has not been to Rome when he writes this. We're pretty sure that Peter uh, introduced Christianity to Rome, but Paul hasn't been there yet. Rome, we know, was a home to this large, diverse Jewish population until the year 49. Of this, well, we know we get an idea of this from just history that we have, but there's a um, bit of a hint to this in Acts 18:22. And listen to this. This is through the historian Suetonius. The Jews constantly made disturbances at the instigation of Christus. Christus, which is kind of vague, right? We don't. This is the reasoning. The historian says that the Jews were kicked out of Rome in 49. Just made disturbances at the instigation of Christus. We don't know who Christus is. Could it be a misspelling of Christus, which is Latin for Christ? Could it be that Suet, I don't know how you say the guy's name, is making this argument that, or is saying, I should say, that the Jews were constantly making disturbances at the instigation of Christus, at the instigation of Christ? Um, all of this sort of, I think, points to this idea that Jewish Christianity at this time was largely new and it was misunderstood. Um, who is this Christ guy, right? These Jews keep talking about him. Some of the Jews do, some of the Jews don't. They keep talking about him, and they're creating disturbances. What are these disturbances? I have to guess that part of it is that the the emperor at the time called himself a god, and then Jesus comes along and says, right? Um, and so they create disturbances. I think that's a good chance that's probably true. So Claudius, the emperor, dies in 54. So there's this 7 year gap where the Jews are out of Rome. And the Jews start to come back then after 54. But in the meantime, the churches had become primarily Gentile in nature because the Jews were gone, right? And so when the Jews come back, you can imagine, I mean, think of any church, right? Um, if a large group of folks, half of them leave for 7 years, and the church as it was on is ongoing, then that group comes back after 7 years. There's going to be some considerable tension in there, right? Some factions, right? Some things don't change. Um, and Paul writes to this church of many factions in Rome here. We in about 57, about 3 years after, 2 3 years after they're starting to sort of come back together. He says um, that Christ came to declare the power of God for salvation to the Jew first, and also to the Greek, and also to the Gentiles. So basically, he's writing this, and his answer is, "Hey, Jesus is for everybody. Don't let this butting of heads, these factions, be the thing that divides you, because Jesus doesn't divide you like that. So, why then does Paul write Romans? Well, that thing I just said, to address the division, but also because in the earliest years of the church like this, there's so many different versions of the gospel, versions of the story of Christ being presented, and Paul writes as an authority. He was seen as an authority in those days, and so he's trying to get at this question that everybody's trying to get at: Christ's death and resurrection. What's it mean for us? Why? And people have made, people at the time and still do, are making different assertions, and he's trying to say, no, this is the way. So again, clarification for the Jews, the law, the Gentiles, and you'll see this as you read it. And keep in mind that at this point, the Jews have been out of the picture for a while in Rome, and so the Gentiles seem to have sort of the upper hand, so to speak. But Paul quotes the Old Testament quite often, the Hebrew Bible, Israel's scripture, the Jewish scripture. He 90 of his Old Testament quotations throughout his letters, 50 of them come from Romans. So he's trying to base all of this in this argument that um, Jesus is the Jewish Messiah and also came for the Gentiles, came for the non-Jews. He's trying to base all his argument in Old Testament scripture. And then finally, there's this little bit about he's trying to get support for a future mission to Spain. Did he ever make it there? Probably not, but we don't know that. So here's the 40,000-foot outline, and we're going to go a little granular in the next video, but Romans 1 through 8 is the power of God to save all humanity. And 1 through 8, it's kind of going over the same ground, just doing so in different ways, trying to say the same thing several different ways. And this is a powerful rhetorical technique, saying the same thing in different ways so that different people can hear it. Paul is this masterful orator and persuader. He's really good at making his point, which is probably why he was viewed as such an authority in those days. So then we go to chapter 9 through 11. He's making the proof of what he said in chapter 1 through 8, the righteousness of God displayed in Israel. And then in 12 to 15, the righteousness of God displayed in the Gentiles. So he's bringing all these people together, and then he ends in the last chapter with just some personal greetings and final instructions. Remember, this is a letter. And finally, all of this is to say that Romans, I think, might be the most difficult book of the Bible to read well. There are some books of the Bible, like Revelation, for example, that's full of symbolism and things like that. This is difficult in a different way. It's got this really difficult cadence to follow. Ask an internal question, go down a rabbit hole, answer the internal question, sort of, right? That's difficult to follow when we're just reading something. It would, this would, I think the way we read Romans or interpret Romans would totally be changed if we had a video of Paul doing this, because you can see tone and intonation and things like that. It's dictated, not written. I think that provides kind of its own challenge, and it's overall trying to address this tough question of has God abandoned his people, right? Who is Jesus really for? So it's difficult, and yet it's one of the most well-loved. It is absolutely, in my opinion, Paul's masterpiece. The Greeks in that time and place in the world often referred to these writers' most top, their top work as their Summa. Summa. This is Paul's Summa. So I'm going to encourage you to read this one well. Honestly, the best way to do it, if you can stomach it, just because of the cadence of it, is to read it all at once. It's 16 chapters. It's not like crazy to think you could read the whole thing at once. You really could. It would be a lot, but if you can stomach it and if you can read it slowly and kind of keep your attention to it, it's probably best actually to read it all at once or do it in chunks. Chunks is the way that our schedule goes. I would just encourage you, try not to proof text Romans too much. Try not to just, pick one little verse out and plant it on your bumper sticker. Because, the context of the whole Bible is important, but particularly in something like Romans, it's important. So I'm looking forward to reading Romans with you, and happy reading.